All right, I wanted to talk to you about painting today. We're going to work with only black paint. Some of you will be working with a black acrylic paint this first semester. All of you will be working with it second semester if you're a BFA student. All right, so this is black paint. You're going to probably all have different types of black paint unless you use the school's supply system of ordering from Blick. U-Track is being sold through Blick these days. So black paint, I'm going to put a little bit of black paint, and what I normally ask my students to do is to take the tip of their thumb, that digit, and spread about that much pigment. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. Hopefully you can see that in the camera. Make sure that you close up this cap after you've finished with that, because you do not want the paint to dry out. You're also going to be using two types of brushes today. One is a round tipped brush, all right? And the reason it's called round tipped, if you look at that straight on, it looks like a circle. And this is a flat tipped brush, right? From the side, it looks like this. And then it should come to a kind of nice line at the top of that. So that's a flat tipped brush. We're gonna start with the round tipped brush. This is kind of the typical thing. Let me just really quickly talk about the types of brushes. There are acrylic brushes, watercolor brushes, and oil painting brushes. Because we will be painting on paper in this exercise, I would strongly urge you to look for watercolor brushes. They're softer bristles. They allow you to paint the pigment onto the piece of paper. Acrylic brushes are stiffer, right? So I have a much more durable bristle that's being used here. This is a great tool to push paint into canvas, a much more textured surface. So it almost acts like a knife where you can push it into the canvas. A softer bristle will allow it to lay down the pigment onto a piece of paper, okay? So I have my pigment, and I have a water container here. What I'm going to do is first show you that when I dip my brush into here, I'm going to charge my brush, and you'll notice I'm rolling that brush over, making it thick, right? So it's not clumpy, but I'm trying to charge my brush. Brushes are made so that they're taking the pigment into the base of the brush. That's the reservoir. A watercolor brush will reserve the pigment at the base end, at this end, and allow it to then be distributed to the tip. All right? So you're gonna notice that because this pigment is pretty thick, when I put down a line here, let me get the paint out of the way. When I put down a line here, it starts breaking apart, all right? So what I want to first learn how to do is make sure that I add water to this pigment so it becomes more soluble. And you'll notice that what I'm doing is I'm adding just a drop at a time. Never add pigment to water. Always take the water and bring it into the pigment. What this does is allows you to control how much water and pigment go together. If I do it the other way, I'm going to waste a lot of pigment that way, because I'll end up with just this mess of a watery kind of light gray pigment, okay? So again, I'm working that in thoroughly. If I can do this, you'll notice that what I'm doing is not using a palette. I'm not using a flat surface to mix this in. I'm using something that will be a reservoir for my pigment and water. What my rule of thumb here is, if you think of this as melted ice cream, all right, so after the ice cream has started to soften and gone to a liquid state, it still has this kind of pulpy feel to it. It's not runny like water. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start making some lines with this as I move it across the page. You'll notice that I'm getting much more of a line, much more of a solid line as it goes across. So I'm gonna add a little bit more water here. Right. And the trick here is that what I'm going to try to do is create a nice crisp line with my brush as I move it across the page. All right. If I add too much water, suddenly that line becomes gray. All right, so at first this is kind of a trial and error method of adding water and pigment together. Once you get used to it, you get used to the feel of what that feels like when you actually start painting. So I want to come over here and I'm going to draw that across, and it should be able to pull it all the way across that. And again, I want to make sure that it's nice and crisp, nice and black. Okay? The other thing that I want to show you is as you do this, you're going to experiment now with what kind of marks you can put down with a brush, right? If I hold it back here, right, I can put down a very thin line, or I can put down a very thick line, or thin to thick. And I simply, at the very beginning, want to experiment with this line making, okay? One of the things that makes a brush so much more, the advantages of working with a brush over a pen is that I do have control of how I touch the piece of paper. That idea, that sensitivity that this brush has can make it seem like you're being blunt, or it can make it seem like you're being sloppy, right? I can do a whole bunch of different things that look delicate, look fast, look simple, look complex. So I can experiment with that as I start mark making. The other thing that I want you to do is a flat tip brush allows you kind of a different level here. If I'm trying to take something and make a, say, square that's solid black, this flat tip brush allows me to cover a big area and keep a very consistent quality to that paint, okay? So if I'm trying to make a big area of that solid color, a flat tip brush is the way to go. All right, so we've experimented a little bit with mixing the pigment, and then getting the right amount of water and pigment together is one of the main things that you have to do. Again, what you're trying to do is notice that as you lay down, say, this pigment, you're gonna have areas, if I have too much water, where they turn gray, right? In the areas where I have the right amount of water, I get black. Now, that's gonna be something that you may wanna play with as well, the idea that you can control the value or lightness and darkness of this pigment. Right? It's certainly worthy of experimenting. But one of the things that we need to know is how to make flat opaque pigment. And flat means that it's not going to have lumps, and opaque means that it's blocking out the white of the paper. When it turns gray like this, it means that it's allowing the pigment to disperse across the page. So when light goes through that pigment, it's hitting the white of the paper and being reflected back through that pigment. That's what makes it lighter, okay? So I want to learn how to control it, and then I can choose to use it different ways as I see fit. The other thing I wanted to say is there are different ways of holding a brush, and you'll notice that some of the brushes that you're going to buy are long tip brushes, some are only half of this scale, all right? One of the first things that we do as artists, as we switch from something like a pencil to a pen, we think the brush is going to be used the same way, okay? So if I hold it like I would a pencil or pen, I have control over this kind of line, right? Which is fine. It's a nice crisp line. But what I have the tendency to do is make the mistake that I'm using it like a pencil or a pen and I'm doing this, right? And you'll notice that once I do that, you'll see all these streaks start showing up, right? A brush is made so that you can create strokes, right? Ideally, this is made to put strokes together instead of sketching with this kind of thing. Now again, ultimately it's going to be your choice, but understand what the tool is used for, okay? So if I have this method of holding my brush, I have this kind of movement, right? My wrist movement, that arc of a wrist. If I pull back on that, I have a bigger type of motion, right? I have the idea that I can make a bigger kind of swing here. If I pull back all the way here, it looks like I should lose control of the brush. But what it allows me to do is paint from my shoulder. So if you understand that and you try this on your own, is to understand what that shoulder can do. It can move an arc like this. So if I'm standing back from my brush, from my painting, I can create a nice long line by holding my brush at the other end, okay? Do you see how nice fluid of the stroke that is? And if I try to do that same line here, it is difficult to keep that line straight. That makes sense? All right. So one last thing, if you don't, I'll just go to it. Last thing I want to do is talk about cleanup. All right, so I have my paint over here. If I have worked in a mixing container that I can close up like a yogurt container, or I can just take that lid and close this up and it will stay okay as long as I keep it damp. Right? I may have to add water every once in a while. So if this is something that you're gonna take home or you're gonna come bring back to the studio, having it in something like this, you can just close up and keep it with you. You don't have to throw it away. If I do have to throw it away, it means that what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna scrape out all the heavy pigment that I have, all the solid pigment that I have, and put that on a paper towel and throw it away. What I don't want to do is take a lot of thick pigment and put it down the drain. Whether it's your drain or the school's drain, it will clog the drain pretty quickly, okay? So what I want to do is thick, solid pigment I throw away into the trash. The rest of it, like this, I can rinse my brush off and I can put that down the sink. The other thing I wanted to show you is when I take this brush, right now it seems pretty clean, but all the pigment is now up into the base of this. If I don't clean that out, that will dry and ruin the brush. Acrylic pigment dries very quickly, so if I let that dry, I've basically wasted all the money that I've spent on a brush. There are some watercolor brushes that can be $50 to $60 these days. And so I want to be very careful that I'm using my equipment frugally. So with that being said, if I don't have time to wash out a brush, I can keep it in water. This is not ideal, but I can keep it in water for a time and it will never dry out, okay? That's kind of the lazy man's way of doing this, lazy person's way, I should say, of doing this. Ideally, to clean this brush out, I should take some soap and put it in the palm of my hand. I want to put it here, and then I want to take my brush and I'm going to rub it back and forth in that soap. What that will do, it will pull out all the pigment at the base of this, and I can rinse that in the sink. I do this until there's no more pigment coming out of the base of the brush. Once I've done that, I would take my paper towel, right, and I would roll my brush up into that paper towel. This will protect it from breaking the bristles, okay? So many of you will have the disadvantage of having to bring these to class or take it home and back and forth to your dorm or whatever. So you want to make sure that as you're carrying these things, you're not putting pressure on the brushes like this. Anytime I do that, I can break these bristles. And again, I want to set up good practices here so that you're not having to buy this equipment again and again and again.